Okay, we're going to look at how to draw things in Spampede. So there's a specific skill of using fill rect for fill rectangle that you need to learn, but the bigger piece of what we're looking at is iterative development. And so this process of working on really small pieces and testing them and trying to break big problems into smaller pieces than you can even think is possible. That's really how the work gets done. Okay, so I have two sample calls here, one to set color, one to fill rect, and that's going to draw a 10 by 10 square, that's 10 pixels by 10 pixels, at x equals 100, y equals 300, and remember x equals 0, y equals 0 is in the top left corner. So with a focus on that problem decomposition, here's what I want you to try and do is I want you to imagine that you're tutoring a student who's trying to draw this and they're totally stuck. And I want you to give them a simpler problem that they could try to solve before they solve the problem of trying to draw those 5 squares. So pause and come up with some ideas, maybe even a few sets of ideas of what someone could do. So I might say, okay, 5 squares, that's tricky, let's try and draw 1 square. Okay, well the squares need to get bigger, let's see if we can draw 1 square but a different size. Okay, now let me see if I can draw 2 squares, each of different sizes. Then I might transition and be like, oh, let me see if I can draw squares in a loop. And now let me see if I can draw squares in a loop that are spaced out from each other. And now let me see if I can draw squares in a loop that are spaced out from each other and they get bigger in size. And maybe let me see if I can draw squares in a loop that get bigger and are spaced out by more and more each time. And that might be how I write the code too. Let's hop over to Eclipse. Okay, so I'm inside Spampede display.java and I searched for the method update graphics, and there's some comments there about where I should put my code. Okay, let's try those commands that we saw on the previous slide. Okay, now I want to run the code. To do that, I have to run Spampede Brain. So I can open Spampede Brain and run it. Looks good. Does that look like it's at x equals 100, y equals 300? I think so. Let's try drawing a second square that's bigger. Okay, I'm going to move it a bit to the right-hand side. So I'm going to make x be 150. And now, instead of it being 10 by 10, I'm going to have it be 100 by 100. Let's see how that looks. Cool. Drawing these squares is going like I expect. So let me try putting it in a loop so I can draw those 5 squares. So I'll get rid of that other line and I'll say for int I equals 0, I is less than 5, I plus plus. So that loop should run 5 times and just draw the same square 5 times in exactly the same spot. Okay, cool. I didn't screw anything up yet. That's a good sign. Let's see if I can space them out. Maybe I'll make a variable int delta x and I'll set it at 0. And then instead of just 100, I'll do 100 plus delta of x. And let me add 10 to delta each time. Okay, let's try it. Oh, it's weird. It looks like one solid row. I don't see any spaces between the squares, but maybe it's just because they're kind of glued next to each other. I'll try increasing the delta. Let's make that 15 and see if I can see the difference. Okay, that looks great. Something I want you to notice is how quickly I'm going from changing a super small piece of something in my code and testing it immediately. Okay, now let's change the size of those squares. So I'll make a new variable, which is the square size, and I'll start it at 10. And now instead of having this be 10 by 10, I'll use that variable. And every time, maybe I'll add 15. Let's check it out. Oh, that looks super weird. I think I have the problem again where they're kind of glued together. Let's see. Instead of that delta x is how far they're spaced apart. Maybe I'll add the square size to that every time too. Let's see. Oh, it doesn't look exactly right, but that's pretty close. Okay, but so my code does basically what I want, but it's kind of a mess now. Like, I don't think anyone would be able to understand what this was doing. So here I'll update the comment. I think anytime you see just like a seemingly arbitrary number inside your code that's not saved as a variable or anything, that's a bad sign. At Harvey Mudd, we call those magic numbers. So let's say the x start, we'll set that to be 100, and then we can replace that 100 with the x start. And similarly, the 300, let's set that as the y start, and then we can use the variable y start in there instead. That delta x, I don't think delta x is going to make sense to other people. So let me set that as the x space, or maybe even x separation. Okay, I don't think I've changed the functionality at all, but I've been modifying a bunch of stuff, so let's just double check that I haven't messed anything up. Okay, I'm still seeing the same squares. Okay, maybe I'll make another variable that's like increase size by, and I'll set that to be 15. And then instead of just sort of randomly using that magic number there, and I'll highlight all of this and do Command-Shift-F to get some better spacing in there. Now I think my variable names look okay, but I think this is a little confusing that I am also adding it by the square size. And maybe I'll make a note to myself that says, you know, I need to provide a gap between squares. Let's move this up. And this, which depends on square size. And you can imagine if I was using these variables outside of this method, say across multiple places, then I would put them in one spot and probably make them static final variables, or at least all the ones that weren't changing, I'd make static final variables. But I want you to see it as a multi-step process to write code where you come up with smaller pieces you can work on, try iteratively implementing those small pieces, keep testing. Every time you change a few characters even in your code, and then once you've got something that works like you want it to, then you want to go back through and refactor. So that means don't change any of the functionality, just make the code easier to read, maintain, and understand. And when you're drawing things for Spampede, you're probably going to use this method draw square, which is shown here, and you can see that it does the work of setting the screen color and pulling in that cell size, which is a final static variable inside of our preferences class.